Israeli riot police rushed forward, firing rubber-coated steel bullets, trying to disperse hundreds of Palestinian protesters in El Bire on the West Bank. This was the day of rage Palestinian leaders called for to protest Israeli policies on the Temple Mount, or the Haram al-Sharif as it's known to Muslims, side of the Aqsa Mosque. As long as we don't have Al-Aqsa and don't have a country, vows protester Noor, we'll stay here and fight this intifada. At Friday prayers in Gaza, Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh praised what he called the heroes of knives and lone attacks, saying that the battle for Jerusalem is our battle. Reacting to the incident, an Israeli Arab member of the Knesset accused the Israeli police and media of encouraging execution of Arabs in cold blood, all contributing to tensions at a fever pitch. And against this backdrop, the few appeals for calm are being drowned out by the roar of clashes.
You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lines. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still, like dust, I will rise. Maya Angelou.
If there's anything you should know about this conflict, it's that it's less than a century old, it's about land and religion, and like many other things in history, it's not a black and white issue. In the late 19th century, the land of Israel and Palestine was controlled by the Ottoman Empire, which was during an era of elevating nationalism in Eastern Europe, where Jews became a central figure in this trend. Jews developed an idea, originated by Theodor Herzl, that as a group they needed to migrate and create their own state. This idea is today referred to as Zionism. Zionism led to a Jewish migration movement to Israel called Aliyah, beginning in the late 19th century. In comes the Brits, trying to garner support from Jews for World War I, issued the Balfour Declaration, which promised Jews the establishment in Palestine a national home for the Jewish people. Britain had also promised others, including Arab ruler of Mecca, Sharif Hussein, land consisting of Palestine after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in World War I.
We look upon the walls of old Jerusalem, walls which have been destroyed and rebuilt many times. There is a modern Jerusalem with many fine buildings and splendid streets and boulevards. But on this visit, our interests lie within the old city, and here we shall devote all our time. At the Jaffa Gate, an officer directs a strange assortment of traffic. No vehicles are permitted within the walled city, so all trucking must be done on the backs of animals or men.
Having overpromised Palestine, Britain decided to establish a colony. In doing so, they created separate institutions for Christians, Muslims, and Jews, which further divided an overall very interactive population. Delivering on the Balfour Declaration, the British did facilitate Jewish immigration, which, as a result, increased the Jewish population of Palestine by more than 30%. There was also a growing feeling of nationalism in Palestine, which led to a revolt against the British, who, lacking interdependent sovereignty over their colony, flipped their decision to allow Jewish immigration, but promised both Arabs and Jews a joint state in 10 years' time. This angered both Arabs and Jews because of the 10-year wait, and this was a time when Jews particularly needed to leave Europe.
"50 nations who want peace got together. They formed the United Nations Organization. Purpose? To stop wars."
Realizing that Palestine as a colony was more trouble than it was worth, and well after the era of imperialism had ended, Britain turned over the conflict to the newly crafted United Nations. The United Nations was established post-World War II in liberal theory to promote cooperation of states, thinking that with cooperation comes collaboration and peace. The UN Partition Plan of 1947 divided the country into parts of equal area, but the areas weren't connected, and they were oddly shaped. It is more difficult for a nation to control its interdependent sovereignty when its borders are separated by another state's borders. And as you would expect, no side was satisfied with this plan, and the Arab-Israeli War of 1948 began.
In May 1948, Jewish leader David Ben-Gurion declared the independence of the State of Israel. The international legal sovereignty of the state was quickly recognized by the UN. However, surrounding Arab nations did not, and war broke out between Israel and Arab Palestinians, along with many Arab states. By the time of the first UN armistice in June of 1948, Israelis successfully defended all fronts of Arab attacks except for an assault on Jerusalem. Realists would argue the Palestinians would have the edge, given hard power gained through alliances with its Arab neighbors. Whereas a liberal point of view would point out the treaties and those involved in its negotiation ultimately shaped the outcome of the war. Regardless, a second armistice was signed in July and Arabs were disgraced in defeat. The war created over 700,000 Palestinian refugees who fled to neighboring Arab states, and by 1949, only 160,000 Arabs remained within Israel. The Arab-Israeli War of 1948 transformed the conflict from one between Arab and Jewish Palestinians to an intrastate conflict involving many external actors.
Shortly after, Jordan would annex the West Bank, and Egypt would gain control over the Gaza Strip. When it was all said and done, Israel would have 1/3 more land than they would have under the UN partition plan.
While the Palestinians saw the war as a disaster that took away their state, Zionists felt that it was the beginning of their dream for their own state. However, without recognition of their neighbors, Israel will never truly be a state at peace, let alone a state.
The year was 1967. The young state of Israel, just beginning its way, is celebrating its 19th Independence Day. Suddenly the news arrives. Egyptian forces are crossing the Suez Canal and entering the Sinai. Israel enters a state of emergency. There's tension in the streets. At any moment, a war can break out.
As tensions increased, Israel launched a preemptive airstrike and simultaneously launched an invasion of the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula. Egypt induced Jordan and Syria to fire back, at which Israel defeated both, attaining the Gaza Strip, West Bank, Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights. The map of Israel drastically changed as a result of the Six-Day War. Israel doubled their land and completely eradicated any recognition of Palestinian settlements. It is to be said that a state cannot exist without a nation, but a nation can exist without a state. While the Palestinian state may be quenched at this time, Israel is definitely not at peace, as the Palestinian nation promises to revenge.
The Six-Day Middle East War echoes along a second front, the diplomatic struggle at the United Nations Security Council. A series of emotionally charged meetings keeps delegates debating on nearly around-the-clock basis. Syrian Ambassador George Tomei charges Israel with continued ceasefire violations, saying that Israeli tank forces advanced toward a branch of the Jordan River to establish control of a strategically important water resource. He calls it systematic invasion.
The Arab-Israeli conflict post the Six-Day War reverted to its roots of conflict between Arab Palestinians and the State of Israel. To create peace between Israelis and Palestinians, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 242. It required Israeli forces to withdraw from occupied territory and endorsed a two-state solution.
Before the ceasefire went into effect, Israeli government officers announced their victory wipes out previous armistice agreements and frontiers.
The resolution didn't create the recognition it hoped for both sides, and Israel didn't pull out of the land it claimed during the war. Palestine responded by creating non-state groups to promote itself, like the Palestinian Liberation Organization, led by Yasser Arafat. Israel began to occupy new territory, establishing Jewish settlements, which was technically illegal under international law, but Israel argued it wasn't, because Palestine technically wasn't a state. And because Palestine didn't have recognition, it couldn't argue. Animosity between the Israeli state and the Palestinian nation continued to grow and led to the first Intifada, or shaking off, which was supposed to be just a boycott of Israeli goods and services and taxes, but the Israeli response created violence. The first Intifada was also when Hamas, a Palestinian Sunni Islamic fundamentalist organization, was created. They started suicide bombings and other terrorist acts against Israel, but they also started schools and staffed clinics and mosques. The Intifada also led to peace talks between the two nations, which led to the Oslo Accords, where the government of Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization agreed to recognize each other and establish peace based on United Nations Resolution 242. The talks, however, did not establish a Palestinian state. In 2000, Israeli Prime Minister candidate Ariel Sharon led 1,000 armed guards to the Temple Mount in Old Jerusalem, known as the Al-Aqsa Mosque and third holiest place to Islam.
This was the day of rage Palestinian leaders called for to protest Israeli policies on the Temple Mount, or the Haram al-Sharif as it's known to Muslims, side of the Aqsa Mosque.
And the holiest place in Judaism. Nonetheless, the place is a very touchy subject. The protests in response created more violence, which flamed the Second Intifada. The Second Intifada, much like the first, was a rise in Palestinian and Israeli violence, leading to 4,000 casualties from both sides. It may be said, however, that it could have been a sovereignty victory for Palestine because Israel, claiming to be defending civilians, constructed a wall between it and the West Bank, which was at least acknowledgement that there is a border that separates Israel and Palestine. But this wall also included Israeli settlements technically in the West Bank, which Palestine said was another illegal land grab. In 2005, Yasser Arafat died and Hamas won a majority of the seats in the Israeli parliament, which led to Hamas and the Palestine Authority having a debate over how to govern Palestine, which only led to poor governance in the area. In the last decade, Hamas has committed many violent acts of terrorism in Israel, which has led to equally violent invasions into Palestine territory by Israelis, continuing to lead to casualties, both militant and civilian. Each claims to be acting in response to the other, but failure of this idea in liberal theory is to believe that power alone will dictate the result. It requires both sides to cooperate, and for both Palestinians, who are not just Arabs but also Christians and a few Jews, and Israelis to listen to the other story and figure out where their narratives split, and search within themselves for a final resolution to peace.